DTVC Extra podcast. We're going to be looking at Marvel Phase 4. And this is one that I've been meaning to do for a little bit of time now. I actually did record an episode and then just didn't like it and I scrapped it. And, I think the reason why is that I don't think Marvel Phase 4 necessarily deserves the kind of treatment that I gave some of the other Marvel phases on the DTVC Extra. I think in a way, I don't know if I would say it's a turning point in not just comic book movies in general, but even like the movie industry overall. I think there's some through lines in discussing this that are really pertinent in sort of where we're at with movies today. Not just comic book movies, but I think movies in general. And so I don't know, I thought there were some interesting pieces to discuss here. And when I first did it, I kind of did it more like the traditional, like, oh, here are the movies and here are the TV shows and here's what was going on at that time and all of that, which it may not have been horrible, but I just felt like this other approach might be a better way. So we'll kind of see how it goes. I think before we get into that, I did want to kind of touch on the fact that, if you look at some of my older stuff, whether it's, older blog posts, older podcast episodes, I kind of would dump on the Marvel Cinematic Universe quite a bit. I wasn't the biggest fan. I think a big part of that was it wasn't that I didn't like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think I didn't like the idea of it. I hadn't really seen a lot of the movies, and the ones that I had seen, some of them I liked, some of them I wasn't all that keen on. And so, I think I was kind of more dumping on just the concept of it, and then I started watching the movies. And I think where that changed for me was when the Marvels came out. I remember seeing trailers for it when I saw like Fast X and Expendables or I don't know, how do you say the fourth Expendables movie? Expendables, I don't know. Expendables, I think that's probably the better way to say it. But anyway, I saw the trailers for it, and I was like, what is this movie? This looks ridiculous. I can't make sense of it from the trailer. And then Mitch was on, I can't remember what we were talking about. It might have been, because I think the movie came out around Thanksgiving, so it might have been when we were recording for his annual Christmas episode that he comes on for. And he's like, I think you'll like it. It's just a fun space romp. And, he kind of knows, I think, people that are on our podcast here, guests that we have on, people listening as well. I think if you're listening to this, you have a sense of what that means when he says, it's just a fun space romp. He's evoking images of like Fred Olin Ray, Jim Wynorski movies, old Italian movies, that kind of thing. And well, of course, the Marvels wasn't exactly, like a Wynorski movie or a Fred Olin Ray movie. It did have some of that kind of that fun, low budget space romp feel to it, which makes it all the more worse that it was so expensive to make. But either way, I saw the movie and thought, okay, this isn't that bad. I don't know why people are complaining so much about this movie. Now, of course, having seen the other MCU movies, now I realize part of the reason why they complained was that it's not as good compared to those, right? But then, when I was looking to do other topics for DTVC Extra, the thing about the MCU movies is that they're all on Disney+. So they're easy for me to get. And, that was when I started doing, I think, did Phase 1, Phase 2. And one of the things I realized as I was watching them was that I never really grew out of comic books or my love of comic book movies or just comic book characters in general. I was priced out of comic books. Thinking about the early 90s when there was the bubble, the speculative bubble or whatever, when it came up to comic books, where every third issue of a comic book was like a reverse hologram cover that was $5. I had my $10 allowance every week when I would go to the flea market to buy comic books. And when I first started collecting, I think I started after they were 75 cents. I remember when they were 75 cents, but I was more at the dollar range. And I go with my $10 bill and get 10 comics. And then they all went up to $1.25 for the base one. So now it's like, okay, now I get 8 comics for my $10. But then it's like, every third comic, like Spider-Man had his 30th anniversary when I was collecting. It was like 1991. And, it was just like, there was each book that he had, I think he had 4 books at that time. Each one had their own $5 reverse hologram cover. It's like, okay, so now I'm spending, I can get 2 of these if one of them takes out, half of my allowance there. And it just kind of slowly kind of crept it to the point where it was like, I can't afford these comics. If I go to the mall with $10, I was good enough at Mortal Kombat that I could stay on the machine for a fair amount, but also, too, enough people played Mortal Kombat that, you could go in there with like $1 worth of quarters and maybe play all night, because by the time, I got to play, if I could stay on some, but also if I lost, by the time I would get back on the machine again to play, it would be some time. Taco Bell, they were charging 49 cents for a taco at that time. So, for $10, I got much more bang for my buck going to the mall than I did going to the flea market for comic books. So it was one of those things where I never stopped loving comics. I just stopped buying them. And I think that watching the MCU movies again kind of tapped into that feeling for me, and I just sort of kind of got back in that love of comics that I have. So, I don't know in watching the movies if I would say that they are remarkably better than, I think some of them are remarkably better than my initial perception of them. I think the ones that I watched that I didn't care for, I still didn't care for. But I think the thing that surprised me as I was going through all the MCU movies is that there really aren't any duds, right? There's no Catwoman, there's no Elektra, and to be fair, there's not even I'm trying, a Superman 4 or something like that, or a Superman 3, or a Batman Forever even necessarily. So that was one thing that surprised me about it, and it was kind of like this interesting thing. But then the other thing I realized as I was watching these movies was a lot of the guests that I was having on the podcast to talk about talking about direct-to-video stuff, they were also fans of the Marvel movies, and suddenly we had a topic of conversation to discuss. And it's a lot of guests that we've had on that we can talk about these movies with. I mean, Mitch we just talked about, but Ty watches the movies, Freddie Young, Jeanette Ward, we've had on to talk about them before, but even like Chris Kavinsky likes to talk about it. So all kinds of different people that we've had on, we can talk about these movies, and it's kind of fun conversations that we can kind of throw in there. So I enjoy that. I mean, John Cross, he's one that I talk about the movies with as well. So it was like an added form of conversation, which I guess in a way it's an added tangent for people that aren't fans of all the big tangents that I go on with my guests. It was like another off ramp for us. Maybe it wasn't the best thing for me to watch all of these, but that's really where the About Face came from. Is that I just I kind of it rekindled my love of comic books, not so much about the comic book movies necessarily, but the movies were sort of an outlet for that, which I think is going to be interesting as we talk about this, because I think this is where the sort of the love and the hate of comic book movies comes from, is that this thing sort of grew beyond just comic book fandom in a way that nobody expected. That me as a comic book fan in the early '90s never could have predicted that we would be seeing a year like 2018 into 2019 where you've just got Aquaman earning $1 billion. If you had told me in 1991 that an Aquaman movie, a movie based on an Aquaman off the Aquaman comic book would gross over $1 billion, that's just, to me, I mean, the idea of movies making that much money back then anyway, right, would have been ridiculous. But if you told me that in the 2000, the 2010s or whatever, that was more likely, I still wouldn't have believed the idea of that. Even if you told me that there was going to be a Jason Momoa, that's the actor that described him to me, I still would have been like, it's Aquaman. Do you understand who Aquaman is? Did you ever watch the cartoons? Do you get it or no? And so. Yeah, so it's kind of a crazy thing, and I think that's sort of a great place to kind of set the stage for where we are with the MCU Phase 4. So another thing I wanted to discuss, I obviously sports is a big thing for me as well, especially Boston sports. Growing up in the New England area, being a big Red Sox fan and a big fan of other Boston sports teams. You remember when we were talking about the Mutant movies? I talked about a Boston sports radio personality, Jim Murray, who has this concept of play 'em right. Right, that if you go see a band that's been around for a while, you see them in concert, you want them to play their hits right, because this might be the one time you get to hear them play the hits. And so if they're doing jazzier renditions or kind of weirder renditions of the songs, or if they've got a new album out and they're only playing stuff off the new album, they're not playing any of their classic hits, right? It can be annoying, it can be difficult. And that's what with comic book movies, we want them to play it right. We want them to deliver the character that we appreciate. And I think it's one of the things about Kevin Feige and his MCU that did do a better job, I think, than some of the others, was that he was really playing it right. He was playing them right for the most part. That a lot of the characters we were getting were the ones that, even if they weren't exactly the character from the comic book, it was something close enough that he got, that we understood that he got it. And I think that was something that, as an old fan of the books, I really appreciated when I started watching them like that. But I have another Boston sports term or concept that I think is going to play in really well here with MCU Phase 4, and sort of what ends up being kind of the downturn of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that gets us to where we are here in 2025. And I think MCU Phase 4 is the start of that, is what brings us there. So when I was a big, I'm a big fan of the Boston Red Sox. They're kind of my, the team I grew up watching. I got to see them play in Baltimore here recently, so that's the 6th major league ballpark that I've seen them play in. And in the 2000s, they got new owners, and the new owners really wanted to put some money into the team, and their goal was for the Red Sox to win the first World Series in 86 years, right? That their last one that they had won was in 1918, and so they wanted to win one, in the 2000s to kind of break that curse. And they did. 2004, they break the curse, so the first championship in 86 years. 2007, they won a second one, and it was like one of these things where it was like, we were just happy to have won one, but to get a second one, it was, it was beautiful, right? It was like, it was like gravy. Now they've won 2 more since then, so they've won 4 total in that time period. And of course, now we hate the owners because they spend more on Liverpool than they do on the the Red Sox, which we'll talk about. They also own Liverpool FC, so they spend more on that team now than they do the Red Sox. But anyway, that's going to be a point that I get to here. So as you get into the late 2000s, early 2010s, one of the things that was happening just sort of in the sports landscape here in America is that the NFL was becoming king by a large margin compared to the other sports. So like in the late 90s into the early 2000s, you had the NBA was king, and then Michael Jordan retires. Baseball has a little bit of a resurgence, both with their the players hitting home runs like Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa. Also, you had these cool teams like the Oakland A's, who are now no longer playing in Oakland. But I think for younger fans at that time, fans that were a few years younger than me in particular, they really glommed onto that team. They were really big fans. So you had some players and teams like that people, the younger fans really liked and glommed onto. And of course, you had cities like Boston, you had New York, St. Louis, where the teams were just doing really well, and so they were kind of these big markets of there was a lot more interest in those markets than there were maybe in other parts of the country. But at the same time, the NFL is really starting to build momentum, and it is becoming this big, massive enterprise. And the thing I liken it to is when I first got into the English Premier League, it was when the EPL was starting to grow like that. And I remember the EPL was a 365-day-a-year proposition that, like, even if the games were only happening from August through to May, all year round, there were TV shows about the Premier League. I remember, every game was its own season, right? So if Liverpool lost on Sunday, on Monday, everybody talking about how you got to sack Rafa Benitez and get in all new players, and Steven Gerrard's got to go somewhere else. And then if they won the next week and they beat my team Arsenal, it would be like, oh, look at Rafa Benitez. He really has the old magic. He's such a great manager. Look at how great he is. And then with Arsenal, it's like Wenger, the game's passed him by. He needs, all that kind of thing. And the NFL was getting like that. The NFL was starting to get to that point where it's like every week was its own season. That you would just and the 365 days a year you talk about the NFL. But Boston was one of the few cities, even though the Patriots were doing really well, they were winning Super Bowls at the same time the Red Sox were winning World Series. But Boston was one of the few markets where the NFL wasn't fully taking over, right? That the Red Sox were viable enough that they could compete. Other cities that were like that, New York with the Yankees versus the Giants or the Jets, the Yankees were still viable there. Again, St. Louis was one that was like that, kind of out in the Midwest, but a unique one there. I think in Chicago with the Cubs, being a little bit more popular and the Bears not being a great team, though the Bears did have their moments there too. And I think if the Bears are good, but I don't know, the Cubs are always going to be a team like that. But as time went on, the Red Sox were realizing that they weren't able to they're having trouble competing with the Patriots. That the Patriots were, it was a point where, like, it used to be that the Red Sox season would go all the way, that they would end in like October, and that's when the football season would officially start. But now with the football season kind of starting, the football season's official start is in August. And when it started in August, it would start to take fans away from Red Sox games. People didn't care about Red Sox baseball as much, and they were doing everything they could to try to stem this from happening. And so one of the things that they would do is that the general manager of the Red Sox, Theo Epstein, who again, he engineers the 04 and the 07 championships. He wanted to take a break after the 07 because they almost made the championship. They made the Final Four in 08. And then in 09, they kind of got into the playoffs but lost in the first round to the California or the Anaheim Angels, who ended up losing to the Yankees, who won the World Series that year. And there was a sense of like, well, we need to maybe take a break and sort of just have a couple years where we're not the best team, but we're going to let our young players, because there was this cadre of young players that they had, who some of them were part of that 07 team, but there were more of them were coming up. And let's let these players marinate in the minor league systems and develop and come up and maybe have a couple years where we're not that good. He used the term bridge year. We're going to have some bridge years where we kind of have some mediocre teams and then we get into the championship. And the ownership said, no, we're not doing that. We need to go out and get bigger players. And so what Theo Epstein said, he likened it, what he called it was feeding the monster. Because where the Red Sox play, Fenway Park, they have this big wall called the Green Monster, and they have seats. Actually, the new ownership team put seats above that Green Monster so people could sit in those seats. They're like some of the most popular seats for watching a baseball game in the United States. And so he was talking about that like, having to go out and buy these players that, and from you don't buy them from other teams. You get them in free agency. You sign them in free agency. But going out and signing these players or trading for these players when he knew that the team was going to be good in a matter of years if they just let the players they had, marinate in the system and develop, that, he didn't want to do that. But he's like, okay, I'm tasked by my owners, my bosses, to feed the monster. And so that's what he did. He fed the monster. And in 2011, they brought in all of these new players. The team was the best team in baseball up until the last month of the year. And then they had one of the biggest collapses in baseball history and didn't make the playoffs at all. They fell behind two teams in their division, the Yankees and the Tampa Bay Rays. One of the things that ended up happening, there was a shift in the team between the pitchers and the outfield players, and the pitchers kind of had their own thing. What they were doing is they were going to the Popeyes chicken around the corner and bringing back like tons of fried chicken and then drinking a lot of beer as well. They were known as the chicken and beer crew. They got out of shape and couldn't really pitch in the late end of the year. It led to this huge turnover. Theo Epstein left the Red Sox and then ended up going to the Chicago Cubs, where he reversed their major curse as well. So he's been a general manager for 3 World Series winning teams and broke 2 of the biggest curses in baseball history. So he went and did that. They had a new manager. They brought in a new manager. There was all kinds of stuff that they did to completely change the team. They ended up having a bad year in 2012 because the changes they made weren't great. 2013 they cleaned house again, and they brought in all of these players all these veteran players who were kind of looking for another chance in baseball, but they had been on winning teams before, and the Red Sox ended up winning the World Series that year, so they won again in 2013. But also, part of it was those young players that Theo Epstein wanted to let marinate. But this idea of feeding the monster, it's kind of a long metaphor there that I was telling there, but I think it's important because this is the idea with Marvel Phase 4, is that Disney was the monster. And Kevin Feige was Theo Epstein. He was the one who was being tasked with feeding the monster. And I think it's a really good comp, too, because you think about, the way that the Red Sox, with Theo Epstein, where he built a Red Sox team that won 2 World Series and a team that hadn't won a World Series in over 80 years, he built them into this powerhouse that was one of the best teams in baseball, that perennially was one of the best teams in baseball, and that had won multiple World Series and were looking to win more. And Kevin Feige, I think in a similar way, he'd cracked this code with comic book movies in a way that nobody had ever really fully done before. And he was this huge money earner for Disney. And so Disney looked at it as like, we can't rest on our laurels, right? After Infinity War and Endgame, we can't just take a break here and sort of revamp things, rebuild things, kind of start over or anything like that. We need to just keep feeding the monster. And the other thing, of course, that happens in 2020 is the pandemic. And while Marvel does pause, right? They don't release anything in 2020, unlike I think Warner did, right? They released the Wonder Woman movie, kind of both in theaters and online. Marvel didn't. Now they were in situations where they had to pause shooting on certain things, and then had to kind of pick those things back up. So that is something that did happen there. But I think in their minds, I think that kind of made the feed the monster thing even worse, because now Disney's not getting any of their billion-dollar earners from Marvel movies in 2020. At the same time, they're launching Disney Plus, and so this is the one that Kevin Feige talked about more than the movies, was that when Disney Plus was launched, Disney was a part of this sort of the streaming battle that was happening. You think about, at the time, it was Netflix and Hulu. Those were your 2 big streamers. And then, for us, we were big fans of Tubi. Tubi was a big one for us. Those kind of free ones were fun too. But then it was like all of these entities wanted to pull their product from Netflix, or with Hulu, right? It was a matter of who owned Hulu and who was going to be able to create their own thing. So that's where you get Disney Plus comes here, HBO Max pulls stuff off, Paramount Plus comes into things, right? And they start, wanting to work with things like their Star Trek franchises. And the whole point was that, who was going to be the most dominant in this space? Who was going to be the one to rule? And Disney Plus had started off kind of big with The Mandalorian. And there was a sense of like, okay, well, Kevin Feige, it's your turn, right? You're gonna keep this thing going, and you've got more products that you can do, and more things that you can produce for us that can keep things going here, so we can keep building our subscriber base. And I think to a big part, it works initially, right? They come out of the gate really well to start with. I think, looking at the TV shows, because, Black Widow ends up coming out in July of 2021. But before that, we had WandaVision, Falcon and Winter Soldier, and Loki. And I think all three of those were really popular. I mean, WandaVision is the big one that I remember. I can remember being on Twitter and just seeing people talk about WandaVision the way they talked about The Mandalorian, but also the way they talked about other prestige TV like The Sopranos and Breaking Bad or Mad Men or something like that, Succession, right? They were talking about WandaVision the same way. Now, I watched WandaVision, of course, because I watched everything for this Marvel Phase 4, and I don't know that it comes close to any of those. I haven't seen Succession yet, but the other ones I mentioned, Sopranos, Breaking Bad, Mad Men, I don't think it's close to those. I think it's interesting with The Bear, because I don't, it's only one season of WandaVision, whereas The Bears had 4, and I think seasons 3 and 4 of The Bear have been weaker for them, but seasons 1 and 2 of The Bear, right? I wouldn't take the Pepsi challenge with WandaVision in season 1 or 2 of The Bear either. But it still, was a really good show, and it was something, again, the buzz was there. It was as if Marvel was just picking up where they left off with Endgame and was the Spider-Man Far From Home. They're right back where they left off, and now they're in the TV game. And so it's like, okay, everybody look out, because now Marvel's making TV shows. Falcon and Winter Soldier is another big one. I don't think it had quite the buzz that WandaVision had, but there was still a sense that enough people felt like they had to watch it after watching WandaVision. And then Loki comes out, right? And now it's like more Tom Hiddleston, the fans that kind of made the Infinity Saga so huge and so massive, they were sitting at home, kind of still wondering whether they wanted to go out during the, after the pandemic or not. I mean, again, Loki comes out in June, so I know for me, I think I got my shot, my vaccine shot. I think it was in before. I think my second shot was like right before Memorial Day, so it would have been right around that time that I would have been like past the point, or what is it? You had to get 2 weeks after your second shot, I think, before you were like officially in the clear. And even then, I would still be going out with my mask on and stuff like that. But I was trying to think when my first baseball game would have been, because I think there was I went to go see the Phillies play the Nationals around that time. But either way, I mean, because I do think the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that core audience that they had, that was kind of more that like younger millennial set, they were more cautious about the pandemic, right? They were kind of the crew that was more like, hey, I don't have to go out and see people. This is great, as opposed to the people who were like, oh man, this sucks having to stay in all the time, right? They were like, oh, I don't have to interact with anybody. This is fantastic. And so Loki kind of hit that sweet spot for them, right? It was like kind of perfect timing for that. And I don't think there was even a sense then that like things were starting to kind of go down at that point, because again, just having 3 TV shows with, what was it, 12, 21 episodes between the 3 TV shows for, the first half of the year wasn't a lot of content that you had to deal with. But I think it's when you get to the second half of 2021, when you add on 3 movies, right, 4 movies technically, right, because Spider-Man No Way Home came out there. So from July to December, you get 4 movies. And then you got, the Hawkeye TV show as well. So, and I guess there was the What If TV show you could mention too. So I guess there's the What If TV show. So now the content is really starting to kick in, right? They're starting to really, really go for it here. And you start to see some diminishing returns, right? And granted, the theaters weren't fully back at that point. I think Black Widow, it did like the best of any movie to that point post-pandemic. I think it was, that its earnings were like that kind of thing, right? And I was trying to think like Black Widow, and then like I think Shang-Chi was the same thing, right? It was like Shang-Chi had earned the most of any movie, post-pandemic, and then Venom, Let There Be Carnage, I think was a similar thing. Eternals was the first dud, right? And it's interesting again because like I talked about, when I saw Eternals, I was like, oh, this one's not so bad. I don't know why everybody hated it, but the thing I remember when it came out, now granted, I just saw it recently. I saw it like maybe, 4 or 5 months ago. So, what was that, like almost 4 years after it came out. But I remember when it came out that The Eternals was the first one that I started seeing people on Twitter and other social media making fun of it and not getting dogpiled on by the MCU fans. And I've said this before, I think I've said this on other podcasts, right? That this, for me, that was Marvel, the MCU's first if it bleeds, we can kill it moment. And I think we should have probably looked at that as a bigger sign than what it was. I think it was. I think that might have been not so much an oversaturation piece of it, but I think there was a sense coming out of MCU Phase 3 where they were so successful with the movies that they had. And also, again, that between the last two movies, between Infinity War and Endgame, you had all of these comic book movies that were just printing money that probably had no business doing it, right? Captain Marvel probably didn't need to be earning over $1 billion. Aquaman definitely did not need to be earning over $1 billion. The Venom movie didn't need to be earning $850 million or whatever it was it earned. But the industry, when they see those kinds of numbers, they think, okay, well, we need to keep going for these. We need to keep doing these. And so Kevin Feige, I think part of it was every idea he was having was being, rubber stamped by Disney because they wanted to just keep putting content out there, and they felt like there was nothing he could do that would go wrong. Right? I don't think they could have foreseen an Eternals in there. And to be fair, he didn't foresee the Eternals either because he told Chloe Zhao, to not, leave the ending of the film open-ended because we're going to have a sequel to this. And so she did. She had in her mind she was going to create a more self-contained film, and instead he convinced her to leave things open and have the Harry Styles buttoner on the end and all of that stuff. And whereas they didn't do any of it, right? None of that ended up happening because they're kind of done with it. They're not doing anything with that movie anymore. Which I don't know if it's too bad. I don't know that I would say that. I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't know. The other thing I remember reading was Kumail Nanjiani. He said he had to go to therapy based on the responses to this film, and I think that's one of those things where we kind of forget sometimes that they're human beings making these. But also, I think the other thing is that when we talk about human beings making these, their agents go to them and say, hey, you're going to be part of this big Marvel Cinematic Universe thing. I mean, look at this. Look at how much fun all those people had making Infinity War. Other than maybe Scarlett Johansson, right, whose character gets killed off. But otherwise, right, look at how much fun everybody's having making those movies. You're going to be a part of that. And you get all excited, like, yeah, I'm going to be a part of this thing. And you have this fun character, and you have this fun time making the movie, and you're having a great time with the cast and everybody, and everything seems great. And then the movie comes out, and people are like, no, I'm not feeling that, And again, just going back to the previous one, Shang-Chi, where people were finding old stock footage of Simu Liu, when he was doing Shutterstock or not Shutterstock, but one of those, the stock footage collections where you can, you need a picture of people at a boardroom, or something like that, or in an office. He was doing those pictures, and it was younger people were posting those, going look at how funny this is, look at how amazing this is, and it was just this overall this big general celebration of Shang-Chi, and nobody was doing that, right? Nobody was going oh, look at Kamal Nanjiani, doing this or that from this old thing or whatever, and yeah, I think he would have been expecting. I think all of them would have been expecting that, and it wasn't there, But I think there was that sense that fact that a comic book movie like that, an MCU movie, wasn't bulletproof in that sense, that it could be released and that people could take pot shots at it on social media and not have everybody coming to the film's defense. That should have been a sign that things were changing in the market. That what happened at the end of the Infinity Saga with comic book movies was that everybody rushed out to see these things and they wanted to be a part of this thing, but it wasn't the only kind of movie that people wanted to see. I mean, again, the MCU wasn't just built on comic book fans. It was built on general audiences. And I remember people going to see Aquaman, for example, who were hey, they wanted to look for something to do, and on around Christmas time. And they're let's go see Aquaman. That sounds like a fun time. And it kind of lent itself to making, over $1 billion. I mean, everybody wanted a part of this comic book thing. Everybody wanted to kind of see what it was all about. And then once they'd seen what it was all about, they were okay, I don't need it all the time. I need other stuff. And Eternals probably should have been seen as that. The only thing is that they follow it up with two real, nostalgia mining projects. We get Spider-Man No Way Home, and we get Hawkeye. And I think those two there again, probably gave Marvel a false sense of what was possible there. So even though Feige is feeding the monster and he's just pumping out content for Disney Plus, and so we've got, again, in 2021 we've got 3 movies and 5 TV shows, I think it was. It should have been too much content. And, there were things that suffered, like Eternals ended up suffering. But then Spider-Man No Way Home comes out, and it's followed in May by Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. And, those are two just absolute nostalgia fests that everybody loved and everybody wanted to see. And I think, it took what should have been oh, hey, things are going bad here for us. Maybe we need to kind of figure something out here. Whether it's we need to diversify, we need to do other things, or if it was a sense of like, yeah, maybe I don't know how to say it. Like maybe this idea that everybody wants to just only see comic book movies wasn't as true as people thought. And so as we go into 2022, that should have been the message that people were thinking about. And I don't know, I guess because they had such big successes there with Far From Home and Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, they thought, okay, the Eternals was just a blip, as opposed to the blips were Far From Home, No Way Home and Multiverse of Madness. Eternals was the one that was proving the rule. The Eternals was the one that was the harbinger of what was coming. So, I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing. I was trying to think about, I think maybe what I'll do here is my original plan was to go 1 year ago, 2021 for the first one, 2022 for the second one. So why don't we do that? Why don't we take a break here? Because I'm already starting to talk about 2022 with Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, but I think this is really where it starts to turn a bit. And I'm going to also kind of talk about what the legacy has been as we get into 2025 in this past year, where we've got a new Superman movie that comes out and it's struggling to make $600 million. So so why don't we take a break here? You can hear about Nadia and Aiden, and then when we come back, I'll wrap this conversation.
Nadia and Aiden, available now. Told in a unique dual first-person narration style, Nadia and Aiden explores what it means to be American from the standpoint of two kids who grew up in France with an American mother. It also looks at how we define family beyond DNA and blood relations, when life isn't always that simple. You can find Nadia and Aiden on Amazon in paperback, Kindle, and Kindle.
All right, we are back, and we're going to wrap up this conversation about Marvel MCU Phase 4. So interesting parallels here, I would say, is that these early successes in 2021, especially with the first 3 TV shows, and then also with Black Widow and Shang-Chi, not doing as bad necessarily as they thought. I think you can also talk about, Far From Home doing well, too. The parallels are actually very close to what was happening in 2011 with my Red Sox after they had signed a bunch of players. So, like, they signed this, they traded for this one guy, Adrian Gonzalez, and then signed him a big contract. He was a first baseman with the San Diego Padres. They traded a first baseman, Anthony Rizzo, who ended up being traded from the Padres to the Cubs and was part of that championship-winning team. Actually, when Theo Epstein took over the Cubs, he got Rizzo from there. Rizzo also played with the Yankees as well, but he ended up being one of the best first basemen of his generation. And Gonzalez wasn't bad. I mean, he was really good at that time. He was one of the best. And, I remember there was a game where they played the Yankees. There's a series against the Yankees. It was this really big, high-profile series, and he hit a home run off of maybe I don't know if it was one of their big pitchers, one of their big relief pitchers, but he had did this kind of leaning swing that was very similar to the swing style of Ichiro Suzuki. So if you ever look up Ichiro Suzuki and see how he swings online, Adrian Gonzalez had that swing, and they won the game with this home run that he hit using this unique swing that he'd never really used before. And it was just a sense of everything's going great, right? This is just a beautiful thing. And I would say that moment there, that beating the Yankees moment, that might be your Spider-Man No Way Home moment, right? That okay, yeah, this team could do anything. And the other thing too that's interesting when I think about those combinations here, or rather comparisons, right, between the MCU Phase 4 and that 2011 Red Sox team that collapsed so epically. And the other thing too, I think the chicken and beer collapse is probably not the end of Phase 4, right? It's probably what happens with the Marvels at the end of 2023. That's probably more the chicken and beer collapse. It's almost like this Red Sox team collapse, that 2011 year, it's probably a span of, Phase 4 into Phase 5, maybe. Maybe that's probably a more apt comparison here. But I think, again, that going back to that comparison between those two, that sense that with that Red Sox team, they were just going to keep steamrolling, they're going to win, and that nothing bad was going to be happening there. At the same time, that again, the MCU, when they come out with those first 3 TV shows, there's that sense, there's kind of a similar sense, right? I think it was the same feeling that we had as Red Sox fans, that Marvel fans would have had, that hey, Marvel's still on a great track here. They're still pumping out great content. This is all really fantastic. What are they going to do next? And I think, as lackluster as Black Widow might have been, for a movie that came out right after people were getting their shots and just starting to come back to the movie theater, it still did well for that time. And I think you could say the same thing about Shang-Chi, and I think you also say it about the Eternals. I think that kills the Eternals, right, is just the feedback that it got, the poor critic reception, and the fact that fans were crushing it. And again, you look at that maybe as a blip. And I was trying to think of a game or a series that the Red Sox might have had in that window that was maybe like a harbinger of what was to come there. I do remember going into September, we had a sense that things were going bad, but that would probably be more like, Ant-Man and Quantumania and Thor, Love and Thunder, which we are going to talk about in a second here. So it's probably a little further down the road. I guess the other thing too is that maybe, because the Red Sox had this horrible year in 2012, and maybe that's maybe my metaphor is going all over the place. But the point is, again, Disney Plus had no reason to think that they weren't going to keep printing money, and that the TV shows that they were making weren't going to just keep bringing in more subscribers to Disney Plus, and that the movies weren't going to just get more butts and seats, right? That okay, we almost pulled $1 billion with Doctor Strange, right? We've got that in us for some more here. We're gonna make more, of these shows, and these all this stuff is gonna pull in more stuff, and so then they open up the year 2022. So I've already talked about Doctor Strange, but before Doctor Strange, we get Moon Knight. And I remember when Moon Knight was coming out. Moon Knight was one of my favorite Marvel characters. I just always got a kick out of him. When I was writing my free write exercises that I was doing on MySpace when I was writing my first novel, which I still haven't published it. I'm going to probably try to get it done this year. So if you're first time listening to the podcast here, I have published 5 other novels. So this is just a new. This is this first one here that I've written. I've just kind of been working on it for a long time, but I'm hoping to get it out this year. But anyway, I would write these free write exercises about these goofy characters, and one of them was essentially he was the Mayor McCheese, which I turned into the Baron Von Dieter for the Von Dieters fast food franchise I created in my books. But the Baron was encountering Moon Knight in Chicago and having to deal with him. So I think I changed that character to the Scarlet Dragoon or something like that. I made up some goofy name. But it was just kind of this funny idea of Moon Knight fighting the Mayor McCheese. And that's kind of how I saw Moon Knight. I always liked him. I always liked having him interact with Spider-Man and all that stuff. He was kind of fun. But I wasn't sure what they were going to do with him. What was Moon Knight going to be? But I remember the way people were selling Moon Knight to us, especially like critics and people who did like clickbaity ads and stuff or clickbaity videos on YouTube and stuff. They were talking about Moon Knight like he was Marvel's version of Batman, which kind of isn't exactly that, right? There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of different stuff there that Moon Knight brings to the table that Batman didn't really have. So he's not quite, but I think if fans who weren't familiar with Moon Knight, and that's the thing to keep in mind with a lot of the people who were watching Marvel movies, they were not comic book fans. They were new to this stuff. And so for them, the idea of Moon Knight might not be grabbing them as much as like some of the other characters that they would have recognized outside of comic books. Moon Knight was a new one. And I think the way that they decided to do Moon Knight, where it was just Moon Knight, and he was just having these weird experiences with F. Murray Abraham playing the god of Khonshu, I guess was that whatever it was. I kind of enjoyed it. I don't know that it's up there as like one of my favorites, but it was definitely kind of a lackluster response. People were like, "Well, what is this about?" And it's one of the ones that Kevin Feige talked about with this whole feed the monster thing. It's just like, oh well, Oscar Isaacs wants to play Moon Knight. Let's just do it. We'll just do it. We'll make it happen, and this will be fine. No, you can't just do it, right? You got to have like a thought in mind, a plan in mind. One of the things Feige's talked about is that a lot of times they don't have an ending when they make their movies, right? When they start the movie, they just go for it, and then they let the ending come. And I know, I think Stanley Kubrick was like that. I think Stanley Kubrick talked about how like the movies would end themselves. He would kind of figure out the ending as he went along. I know when I write my novels, I have an idea of what I want the ending to be, but sometimes I change that on the fly as I go through it. Sometimes that ending changes. It's one of the things, whenever we talk about, I'm part of like a writer's group here in Philadelphia, and one of the tips is always like, well, you should always know what your ending is before you start writing. I don't know if that's always the case, but I do kind of feel like you got to have a sense of like what you want to do with a character, and really think about, is that something that the audience is going to want to watch and they're going to appreciate? Is it something that is going to work for them? And I think, having Moon Knight interact with other characters would have been maybe more fun for audiences. But yeah, I don't know. But it was I think it was the first one out of their TV shows that didn't really land the way that like you had the first three. I'll kind of put What If aside, right? That's a cartoon. It's kind of a slightly different thing. But the first three shows all were huge successes for Disney Plus. Hawkeye then had that nostalgia factor where they bring Kingpin in, plus they add in Yelena Belova. And I think Haley Steinfeld was really fun as I can't think of the characters' names, but whatever the one who worked with Hawkeye. I don't know why I can't think of her name, but anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that there was a lot of fun stuff happening in that show, and that was one of the first ones that I watched. Actually, I watched it before any of the other TV shows. I think I can't remember, or maybe I did watch Moon Knight as well. I don't remember, but anyway, but Hawkeye, I really appreciated that, and bringing Kingpin into the whole thing, and then using Echo. It was all kinds of really good stuff going on there. And so Moon Knight's kind of the first one that kind of just doesn't quite land that well. And then for movies, right, I think we get Love and Thunder, Thor Love and Thunder. And at first when I watched Thor Love and Thunder, I was like, well, how do people like that one less than Thor Ragnarok? Because it seems like they're the same movie. And I was talking with Freddie Young about that, and he was like, well, because they were menacing kids, right? The baddie, Christian Bale's baddie was menacing kids, and it's kind of like, yeah, that's a good point, right? Like, there were no kids getting threatened or not tortured, but threatened and scared and harmed and that kind of thing. There wasn't really that going on. It's almost like Taika Waititi. He took what was going on in Thor Ragnarok, which again, I wasn't the biggest fan of that one, and he kind of put it to 11 on Love and Thunder, and people actually didn't really respond well to it. I mean, the movie does well enough in the theater, but the critic reviews, again, they were kind of as tepid as they were for the Eternals. And it's possible that the Eternals maybe does slightly, maybe like $650 in the box office if it wasn't kind of still coming off that COVID time. That we've kind of now we've gone through this period. We've had 4 movies come out in Eternals, Spider-Man: No Way Home, Doctor Strange, and then the Thor Love and Thunder one. The 2 in the middle that do really well are the nostalgia fests. And I don't know if maybe they could have looked at that and said, okay, maybe something's going on here. The other thing that I know is that they were already hip deep in these movies. So they were doing, I think, Thor Love and Thunder, Wakanda Forever, and Ant-Man Quantumania. They were filming those all at the same time. So now we're really feeding the monster, right? And one of the things I remember with that Red Sox season was there was some turmoil amongst the team. I think it was more behind the scenes, but again, I talked about that division between the pitchers and the hitters, but some of the players weren't happy. So the owner took all the players out on his yacht and got them all like Beats headphones. Remember at that time, Beats headphones were like the best thing ever, and I think he thought that was going to fix everything. You're bringing them on the yacht and doing all of that. Kind of the way maybe, the Nostalgia Fests, people thought they were going to fix everything. And then it's like, okay, we're back with Thor, Love and Thunder. And, it does well enough, but people aren't the biggest fans of it. That brings us to the last 2 TV shows that we get here, where and I'm going to kind of pair them together because I think... actually, the 2 TV shows, right, they're going to come before Wakanda Forever. Actually, Ms. Marvel, I forgot that Ms. Marvel came out before, or it came out during the time that Thor Love and Thunder came out. Ms. Marvel, I watched that one finally, and, because that one I don't think it wasn't... I don't think it got the lackluster response that Moon Knight got, but it also didn't get this is the most amazing thing ever response that like WandaVision and Loki got in particular, but also Falcon Winter Soldier got more positive, I think, responses than Ms. Marvel. And for me, I think the thing about Ms. Marvel when I watched it was there was this sort of this tonal, I don't know, dissonance, if that's the right term. There were moments where the show felt like it was really made for teen kids. And, me as a 46-year-old watching it, I was like, well, yeah, the teen kids thing, that doesn't exactly work for me. There's nothing I could really relate to with that, right? But then there's the moments where, Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan, where she's going back to Pakistan and she's sort of, confronting the history of the partition and what it meant for her family and for her people. And the strife and the turmoil at that time, and she's sort of seeing it firsthand. And I was like, well, that's not really teenage stuff, right? Like, that's more for 46-year-old Matt than it is for a teenager or something like that. And so I was wondering who the audience was for that. But then I was thinking, like, okay, why don't you just make something and let it find its audience? And I think that's maybe the idea with Ms. Marvel, is you make it and let it find its audience. And I think there were some younger people that did really respond positively to it and really liked it. One of the interesting things I thought too that was I got a kick out of was that, again, we've talked about how that sort of that younger millennial cohort was the one that that younger millennial cohort that was kind of like the core of like the really big Marvel movement. I'm talking about younger people that were born kind of like late 80s, early 90s in that window. They kind of poke fun at that age cohort in the in the TV show, like when Kamala Khan, when she goes to see her guidance counselor, and the guy that's there as the guidance counselor, he's that character, he's that age cohort, that's him. And I thought it was interesting that they were poking fun at that age cohort because that's their core audience there. And I know that they've been trying to pivot out of that audience somewhat and into a younger Gen Z audience, which I guess is where Kamala Khan's character would have been placed, because they recognize that age cohort is starting to age out a little bit. And in the sense that, during the pandemic, that age group now is closing in on 40, right? They're in their mid to late 30s at this point, and so they have kids now. They have other responsibilities, and so when you were, if you were born in 1992 and you were 26 in 2018, 27, and 2019, when you get to 2023, you're now what? You're 32, 31, 32, right? You're married. Maybe you've got one or two kids. These kids are going to be young. These kids are going to be 1 or 2 years old. And so, now 3 Marvel movies a year is a little bit more of an ask. For those 3 Marvel movies a year, maybe they're picking one of the 3 to go to and not going to the others. Also, they're not going to go see the movie again, probably. They're going to go see that movie one time. So, you look at something like Endgame that's pulling in over $2 billion. Part of what's causing them to pull in over $2 billion is people going to see it more than once. And I think one of the reasons why Captain Marvel did so well, that it did over $1 billion, I think people saw it, and then they went through this binge of watching all of the MCU movies to that point going into Endgame and watched it again, right? It would have still been in the theater, so they went and saw it again. I think the other thing too with these sort of these $1 billion earners is that it's not just going to see it yourself again, but bringing other people with you. Evangelizing the movie and the series to other people. And I think what happens now is that as that age cohort has sort of aged out, and the people that they've evangelized to go see it are seeing even less than they are. Now they need to try to find a new group, and of course that Gen Z group, they're kind of like the same way that Gen X was, where they're not easy to pin down. Nobody knows exactly what to do with them, and I think there's also maybe a sense of anarchy in them as well, that like they would rather see the MCU movies crash and burn than actually go watch them and get excited about them. So I wonder if there was a sense with this with Ms. Marvel to try to pull in more of that Gen Z audience. I think that's probably where the partition piece would also maybe play well, because they might think like, okay, well they're more interested in that history and wanting to know about what led to these the Pakistani split from India during the independence. And so I think that was the plan with it, and I think you could still work in that direction. I think you still would have something there. I mean, I enjoyed the show. I put it up there as one of my favorites of the MCU shows. So I could see something there, but I think the problem is when we get into the Marvels in 2023, that next year, which is the disastrous one that we talked, that I led the show talking about, is the one that was the biggest disaster is the one that gets me into watching the MCU movies again. But that was their big disaster. Part of it was that they gave her a really big part in that movie. I think she needed a couple more shows, right? A couple more seasons of her show to keep building that Gen Z audience maybe that might have been drawn to the themes in that show that resonated more with that age cohort. And instead they were like, we're going to do one season and then the next we're going to do this movie, and we're going to do kind of the whole wacky family thing, which I think that's another piece of it, is that when you watch the Marvels, Kamala Khan's family is kind of more this sort of this wacky, I don't want to say ethnic family, this wacky family, right? Well, I guess ethnic is the right term, because you think about like in the 60s and 70s, that would have been an Italian family, right? And then as you kind of get into the 80s, it's probably more of a Latin American family. And now, having it be a Pakistani family kind of feels like it fits in that mold. And I I don't think it needed to be. When you watch the series, that's not what it is, right? The series, there's much more depth and nuance to their characters. There's much more going on there that the movie couldn't capture. And I think we needed a couple more seasons of that. Then you can make them be wacky in the movie once we've really gotten to know them even more. But again, it's feeding the monster, right? We're going to make one series with Ms. Marvel. We're going to take a character from WandaVision, because everybody loved WandaVision. We're going to take a supporting character from that, and we're going to put them in, the Marvels at the end of 2023, and it's going to be a huge hit, because the first movie was $1 billion earner anyway, and everybody loves these characters. This is going to be great. Again, you're feeding the monster, and at the same time, your audience is sort of starting to kind of feel a little bit more disconnected, and I think, I don't know, so this is kind of what's interesting, right? Is that we then get into kind of the end of the year where we get She-Hulk Attorney at Law and we get Wakanda Forever. She-Hulk Attorney at Law, I think, is another one where there's this feed the monster sense where, going back to Theo Epstein, where he wanted to kind of develop his younger players and have them sort of anchor the team further down the road rather than trade those players for established veterans that were worth a lot of money that everybody knew. I think you could say the same thing about She-Hulk. That when I watched She-Hulk, I thought it was a good show. I've talked about this before in other podcasts, that I think it's like the Monk of the MCU or the Psych of the MCU, and I feel like it could fit in that same mold. But when you're talking about feeding the monster and you're talking about wanting big hits, everything needs to be a home run. Everything needs to be a big sellout, right? Everything needs to be huge. And again, I think there's a sense, too, that the Red Sox at that time, when they're trying to compete with the Patriots, who the Patriots are part of this NFL machine, this NFL juggernaut that is just steamrolling everything. I don't know if by 2010, 2011, if the Major League Baseball had gotten to the point where they weren't having World Series games on Thursdays and Sundays when the NFL played. Actually, at that time, it would have been Sundays that they would have been afraid of. There was a point when I was growing up where baseball was king. And baseball didn't care where they put their games. If their World Series games were going to be the top viewed shows of that night. It didn't matter what night they were on. But I think by the 2010s, they're getting to that point where they're saying, no, you know what? We don't want to have our World Series games on the same night as NFL football. Even if it's regular season, week 6 NFL football, you can't have baseball playoffs against it because it'll get killed. And that's, baseball's marquee event. They don't want it to get killed by football. And so I think there is a sense maybe of this sort of this current coming under here where feeding the monster is not going to be enough, that it's not going to work. And I think She-Hulk is one of those ones that sort of falls victim to that because Disney needed to feed, Feige to feed the monster, and they needed hits. They needed more of these sort of WandaVision, big buzz kind of deals, where everybody on Twitter's talking about them. On the other hand, She-Hulk's getting no buzz, right? And again, She-Hulk is another one that kind of falls victim the way Eternals did, where you had bros sort of coming for it, and people weren't defending it from the bros. They were sort of letting the bros pick it apart. And I think for me, if you look at that and say, okay, instead of saying it's got to be a home run right out of the park and it's got to win, a bunch of games that season or whatever, and instead say we want to develop something, and say the same thing with Ms. Marvel, but we want to develop something over multiple seasons and build an audience here of people that come to Marvel for different or just looking for something different. I think the idea of a superhero show that's that follows the same beats as a Monk, like a kind of a law procedural comedy with She-Hulk, right? As with different superheroes and things like that involved. It would have been it's a really fun idea, but the thing is that the show couldn't be that, right? It couldn't just be the Monk or the Psych. And the thing is, for USA Network, when they were producing shows like Monk or Psych, they didn't need those shows to be Breaking Bad or Mad Men or any of those things. They didn't need them to be the biggest hits. They didn't need them to be whatever other big hits were on at that time. I can't remember. Friends might have been around the same time as Monk. I can't remember. Whereas Disney Plus was like, no, you can't put something out that's not a huge hit. We're not building anything anymore. There's no more building. I think back to the early MCU. First Captain America movie doesn't do the huge numbers. But look what it builds to where you get to Civil War, and it's making over $1 billion. There's when you're feeding the monster, you can't build anything, right? You're not building anything. You're not growing anything. You're not starting anything from a small, sort of an embryo and letting it grow into something bigger. No. When you feed the monster, everything's got to be flashy and big, and it's got to be pulling in a lot of money. So that's where we are with Ms. Marvel and She-Hulk, is that, I think, again, Ms. Marvel had a better reception than She-Hulk did, and I think that's why they felt like they could go ahead. But, I mean, they had to have already been working on doing the Marvels. Like, they had to have already had the plan in mind that, okay, we're going to release Ms. Marvel in June of 2022, and we're going to start shooting the Marvels around that same time. We're just going to, they already figured that character was going to be in there. So in a sense, it didn't really even matter how well the series did, because they were just going to put that character in no matter what. They figured, okay, we're going to be all set here, right? We're going to make this kind of money anyway, right? It's going to be a given that we're going to do this, so let's just go for it. And it wasn't the right idea. It wasn't a good idea. So anyway, so again, we're feeding the monster. It's not going great, or I should say, at this point, they're feeding the monster, but there isn't the sense of like what's going to come in the next year or two, right? There's a sense that they can still just kind of keep plowing along here. That like, okay, well, if She-Hulk doesn't work, then the next series we put out is going to do really well. We'll figure it out. So then the last movie of the year, the last movie of this phase is Wakanda Forever. And again, you're talking about a movie that followed a predecessor that made over $1 billion. I think Black Panther is one of the best MCU movies. It's one of the best comic book movies ever for me. It's one, or at least one of my favorites. I shouldn't say best, right? Because that's getting into best is saying something objective. Where I'm trying to, I try to keep these things subjective because, I don't want anybody, there's no point in arguing over subjective ideas. But yeah, I've got Black Panther as my number 3 MCU movie behind Captain America: Winter Soldier and the third Guardians of the Galaxy movie. That's how much I like that one. So. Wakanda Forever, it had a lot though on its shoulders that it had to carry, right? Because this is the first movie after Chadwick Boseman passes, and so they had to make sure they got that right. And I think they do get it right. I think with the opening and the end, they get it right. But there's a lot of things that they don't get right in that movie. I think, again, talking with Freddie Young about this one, what were they doing with Ironheart? Again, they ended up making a TV series about her. She, I guess it's the last TV series of Phase 5 that's out now. But it's kind of like, what is that character there for? And part of the problem was that I think they wanted this idea of Shuri mentoring Ironheart, but there really wasn't anything for her to mentor because she's going through her own stuff as potentially being the next Black Panther, and so it was kind of all over the place with that stuff. And then they bring in Namor. It was cool. I liked bringing him in. I thought it was a cool idea. I liked the idea of doing that, but I think that the thing is, it was also long because they had to add in that stuff about Chadwick Boseman. They needed that in there. And I think it hurt the movie's rewatchability. I think a lot of people saw that one once and said, okay, I've seen it. That's great. I really enjoyed it. No plans to go back and see it again. Whereas I think Black Panther had a lot of rewatchers. I think and I think, again, Black Panther also had that evangelizing factor. I think people saw Black Panther in the theater. They not only went and saw it again, but they brought friends to see it again. They said, you've got to see this. This is that good. And it may have even gotten 3-time watchers, right? People that saw it more than twice in the theater. And again, it's over $1 billion. And I think they just thought, okay, well, we're just going to get that again with this movie. It's just going to be the same thing. Everybody's going to do it. But I think, again, there's a point where if the movie doesn't have the hook that they think it has, and again, it doesn't have the rewatchability. I think if people saw it, I'm sure people saw it and they both said they enjoyed it. They may have also told people, you don't need to worry about going to see it in the theater. Wait till it comes out on Blu-ray or on Disney Plus. You'll probably enjoy it that just as much then. I think this is one of those situations where they could have maybe looked at it and said, okay, Wakanda Forever didn't do as well as we wanted it to do. We figured we had $1 billion earner with this film. Otherwise, we wouldn't have given a budget of $250 million for it. But yeah, I think there's a sense of this is maybe, I don't know if comic book fatigue is the right term. I don't think this is the right way to say it, but they should have. I think you can look at it and see this movie, even though it does $850 million. It's hard to say a movie that does $850 million is a bust, right? It's not necessarily a bust, but I think it's a harbinger of what 2023 is, right? And everybody wants to talk about the whole Barbenheimer thing, and I don't know. I don't want to say it misses the point, but I think what we should have seen coming here with this is that. That the monster had been fed to such a degree that it was still doing well, right? I mean, again, Black Panther at 860 million, it's still, it's the top 10 earner that year. And Disney still had, Doctor Strange, Multiverse of Madness, and Thor: Love and Thunder that all did well for them. But yeah, I mean, I guess, one of the things people talk about with the Barbenheimer year is that, you don't get a comic book movie, high up like that. But when you look at 2022, obviously the Avatar movie, for whatever reason, Avatar movies do $2 billion in the theater. I don't know why that is that an Avatar movie has to do that much. I don't know where that fandom comes from, but I guess, yeah, those movies always make $2 billion. But then you look at the other movies, Top Gun Maverick and the Jurassic Park movie. I think that should have been the sign that, okay, you know what, comic book movies don't print money anymore, that audience that was swept up in the comic book wave of 2018, 2019, which these were fans that were not comic book movie fans necessarily. They were people who were swept, who kind of came to these movies that hadn't necessarily seen all of the everything, all of the movies, hadn't necessarily seen all of the MCU movies, hadn't seen all the DC extended universe, or I guess Venom is the first movie of the Sony Spider-Verse without Spider-Man, but they just wanted to see these movies. They were looking for movies to watch in the theater. They were kind of just going out for, looking for something to see. These are the people that will go see Top Gun Maverick. They'll go see, the new Jurassic Park movie or whatever, right? They're not just there for Marvel movies. They'll go see a Fast and Furious movie, right? They'll catch one of those instead. So it's not just that it's a Marvel movie or a DC movie that will bring them out to the theater, right? That's your core. That's that core MCU fandom that, again, is in that like late 80s, early 90s age cohort that they were the ones that were kind of building that up. But when the wave gets to the point where it crests after Endgame, that was a different thing entirely. That was that somehow that core fandom, that core group there had created something so big that everybody wanted to get in on it and check it out. And then they saw it. They saw what it was about, and then they were done. I don't know. I feel like I'm describing like Hunter S. Thompson talking about older people in the 60s, or I say older people, adults in the 60s trying out acid for the first time. It's like, yeah, I tried it. Okay, the kids went to bed at night. My friends and I were over. Once the kids were in bed, we dropped a couple tabs, and hey, okay, it was okay, it was fun, but yeah, I don't need to do acid anymore, right? Just like it's the kind of same way I'm thinking about go to see Jason Momoa in Aquaman, right? It's like, okay, I don't need to, and I do think that group that went and saw Jason Momoa in Aquaman in 2019, I do think a lot of them came out in 2021 to see Spider-Man No Way Home, because that was another sort of cinematic moment where people were like, okay, we're done with the pandemic finally. It's over, right? COVID is this thing that we're going to have to live with, but at least we've gotten on the other side of it to the point that we can live with it. And so we're all going to the theater now. We're all just going to get out there. And it was this moment where everybody felt like they were back together. And it was a unique thing, but I think it's something you can't, bank on. But I think to Marvel's Disney's standpoint is that they want to keep creating those moments. Like, we should be creating those moments every year. Like, once a year, we should have a moment that everybody wants to go to the theater and see the movie we put out. And I don't know that these Marvel movies are necessarily going to do that as much to that extent anymore. And I think this was the point where they had done it, where they had sort of saturated the market so much. And I think what they did was they didn't necessarily turn off their core audience by saturating the market, by feeding the monster, so to speak. I don't think that they turned them off. I think what they did is they removed the impetus for them to have to do everything the moment it comes out. There was no fear of missing out on anything anymore. And that's where it really comes to a head with the Marvels in 2023, is that nobody felt like they were missing anything if they didn't go see that movie. Just the same way that they didn't feel like they were missing anything if they didn't go see Ant-Man Quantumania. And I think that cohort was like, okay, well, we're going to go see the Guardians of the Galaxy, that last movie. And when you see that movie is some heavy stuff. And so there's a sense there of like, okay, well, I saw that one once. I don't need to go see it again. And so that's, again, similar to Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. It's a similar idea, right? That you see it once, that's where you get to that 850 mark, but you need those repeat viewers to get over the hump, to get into the $1 billion number. And they weren't going to do that. But those people are like, okay, that was enough. Getting my parents to watch the kids for a night. I don't really know that I can get them to do that again for Quantumania or for the Marvels. And hey, that's fine. At some point we'll watch them when the kids go to sleep. We'll fire those up on Disney Plus, and that's enough for us. This is starting already with Phase 4. The feeding of the monster had sort of led to this point where, and again, I guess, the Marvels is the chicken and beer moment, right? It's the collapse. It's, the last day of the year when the Rays, the Tampa Bay Rays, beat the Red Sox and knocked them out of the playoffs, and this Red Sox team that was well in first place going into September, the same way that Marvel was on top of the world going into 2021, 2022. By 2023, by September, they're done. And again, they have that one, they sort of have that another nostalgia fest with Deadpool and Wolverine in 2024. And there's also this sort of this reckoning, right? This sort of agonizing reappraisal of the situation, so to speak, where Bob Iger comes in and says, okay, we got to take a break from all this stuff. We're losing money now. We're actually hemorrhaging cash where we weren't hemorrhaging cash before. We were printing money before. We got to figure something out. And I don't know to what extent they've figured anything out other than Nostalgia Fest work. And so that's why I think we're in a point now where we're going to have Robert Downey Jr. back for these two Avengers movies. That there's a sense of like, okay, let's get that crowd back. That crowd that was born in the late 80s, early 90s, who now has kids, now have other responsibilities. Let's see if we can get as many of them back to watch this one last go around and see what we can make this work. The problem is that I think the one thing that this feed the monster approach from Marvel Phase 4 is instructive about is that you can't just pump out content and expect it to all work. But also, you can't just pump out content and expect to build a new audience. And I think that's the other problem here is that the Marvel is their audience is starting to age out. There's people my age who are going to just go watch these movies because I've kind of rekindled my comic book fandom, and so I'm going to go see the next comic book movie when it comes out. It doesn't matter. I'm going to go, but that's me, right? And I'm only one person. I'm not going to be enough to sort of keep that up. If they really want to keep this train going, they've got to look at Gen Z and say, hey, can you guys start coming to see some of these movies? I don't know if they're going to. I don't know. I think there's two issues for them, right? I mean, one is the fact that movies are becoming more expensive, and Gen Z has less money than other generations. But I think the other piece is that they kind of see these as sort of these corporate shill kind of things, which is just a crazy concept to me as a person who grew up with comic books to think of sort of younger generations looking at these as the establishment movies. I saw I've seen directors talk about this now that the movie industry needs to start providing more variety. When I was a kid going to the movies, there was a ton of different types of movies that were out. I mean, I think, recently on All 90s Action All the Time, they covered Crimson Tide, and Scott's guest, Liam, made the comment that, there was a time in the 90s where you could go and watch Crimson Tide in the theater. They don't make Crimson Tides for the theater anymore, but maybe they need to. Maybe we need to start having more variety. It's not about a blockbuster taking up 5 screens, and it's not about Disney, using their properties that they have to try to squeeze out their competition. But I think this is the thing when you have, the movie industry being as corporate as it is. Sometimes you get some fun stuff with these, the Marvel movies. You get something like Deadpool and Wolverine that's a lot of fun, but you also get this feed the monster approach where Disney's mindset isn't just about we need to pump out as much content as possible and make as much content as possible, but you also, at the same time, you want to squeeze out your rivals, right? You want to be able to kind of choke them off. I mean, part of the reason why Fantastic Four was released when it was released was to hurt Superman sales, right? They knew going in that Superman had only one movie coming out this year, and they knew that that Warner only had the one movie coming out this year, and they figured, okay, well, our 3 movies should be able to hedge the difference there, and we can hurt Superman by having that happen. I think what they probably didn't expect, I think what none of them expected was that a movie like Jurassic Park would beat all of them. I think the other thing too that and again, this is maybe coming back to this idea of us having more variety. Sinners. I don't think people expected Sinners to be one that, like, for example, for Thunderbolts, that part of Thunderbolts' gate was affected by a movie like Sinners. They wouldn't have seen that coming. But I think that's a sign that maybe the it's not about fatigue. It's not about comic book fatigue, I don't think, so much as people just want more variety. That wave that hit its apex in 2018, 2019, it crested after that, and people started looking for other things, and Marvel kind of, Disney Plus does what, Disney does what any corporation would do, and they flood the market with more of their product, thinking like we're going to just keep selling at the rate that we were selling at, and it just they kind of hit the law of diminishing returns. Now, I do think there is a point where maybe I think with this year, even though they released 3 movies, I think part of the reason why they had 3 movies come out this year is that they had things like Captain America: Brave New World that were kind of stuck in the hopper, and so I think maybe the better thing probably would have been to release that last year, but I don't think it would have been ready in time, and so they put it out in February of this year. So I don't know if they meant to flood the market quite to the same extent that they did, and it looks like we'll see what their dockets look like going forward, if it's just going to be 1 or 2 movies and 1 or 2 shows a year. But the thing is that when you talk about corporations don't look at it in terms of like, well, it works well for us if everybody, it's a positive for us if everybody does well, that one movie can kind of create momentum for other movies. The way that in Endgame and Infinity War did well, helped Venom and helped Aquaman as well. Nobody really sees it that way. That like, oh, if we put out more rom-coms, or if we put out more dramas, or something like Honey Don't does well and more people want to see it. Or the big one is Naked Gun, right? This summer here, everybody is just praying that Naked Gun does well because they think, okay, well, if Naked Gun does well, we'll get more comedies. What if Naked Gun doesn't have to do well for us to get more comedies in the theater? Like, what if the industry looks at it and says, okay, variety is actually the thing that can help us, right? That it can kind of, we can kind of build something a little bit more. Because the thing about the Barbenheimer year that I think that gets lost when we talk about this is that, yes, right, we did have Oppenheimer do really well. That was, a big deal, that Oppenheimer was such a big hit. But beyond, Oppenheimer, everything else was an existing property, right? Barbie is an existing property. Super Mario is an existing property. Guardians of the Galaxy, of course, we know. Fast X, Spider-Man. Yes, if some of the movies in the top 10 that year from China, obviously, but everything else was an existing property in 2023 that is in the top 10. So Oppenheimer is really more the exception than anything else is. But, is that the one that we can maybe hold on to and say, okay, well, can we do more Oppenheimers in the theater? Does it have to be a Christopher Nolan, too? Can it be directed by somebody else? Again, that's on Disney, right? Can Disney say, okay, you know what? Instead of making 3 Marvel movies this year, what if we make 1 Marvel movie and then we make 2 other films? We make one that's a comedy and one that's a drama. Same with Warner. Like Warner says, okay, we need to make our DC movie. We got to put all our money into this DC movie. But what if, we also make a comedy or the drama, and we put it in the theater? And the Naked Gun movie was made for $42 million. It looks like it's going to maybe gross just south of $100 million. It's going to get somewhere in there. And I don't know what the number was we were hoping for it to be considered a success, and for Hollywood to say we got to keep making those. But I do wonder if Hollywood, and again, the idea of these corporations taking a bath, right, is just complete anathema to them. But what if they do take a bit of a bath to start with, and you start pumping out a variety of movies? What if instead of saying, I'm going to spend $180 million on another Marvel movie, if I do like 3 $60 million movies that kind of run the gamut on different genres? One interesting thing that I heard, I listened to a podcast called Knowledge Fight, and the guy Dan, who's the host, he mentioned this idea of, well, what if instead of doing, like for Marvel being this big juggernaut that it is, and has all of these characters and all of these different things they could do, what if within Marvel they had different genres? And again, this is what I keep talking about with She-Hulk. She-Hulk being their monk or their psych, and that could be an interesting. What if like Ms. Marvel was like a new like Degrassi or something like that? With its own themes, its own unique ideas and unique concepts, but has kind of a Degrassi feel to it. What if you did more comedies? What if you did, you had certain characters that you just did, a complete, comedy movie with, you did an hour and a half comedy that you made for $60 million. It just happens to have Marvel characters in it. That's could be an interesting thing, but then again, would that still? I kind of feel like if you did something like that, maybe it doesn't I don't know. Maybe people don't look at it like, oh, it's another comic book movie. I'm not going to go see that. It's like, okay, it's a comedy. Let's go see what this is about. It's supposed to be funny, and it just happens to have some superhero characters in it or something like that. I don't know. It could be interesting. I mean, the detective genre, right? I think, with a lot of Marvel characters. I mean, Jessica Jones, for example. She could lend herself to really great, like, hour and a half, 2 hour mystery, like a mystery series, kind of like a Columbo kind of thing. And again, I think you could put those kinds of things out. And I think Kevin Feige's talked about this as not having everything be so interconnected. I don't know that the interconnectedness matters so much. I mean, I guess the interconnectedness matters when you're pumping out so much content, right? If you're pumping out so much content and it's all interconnected, people are going to be, they're going to feel like they have to watch it. But I don't even know that you necessarily need to worry about that. I think, Jessica Jones, get Kristen Ritter back and do these Columbo type things where she's solving crimes, solving mysteries in New York City. I think that could be a really fun show. And again, I don't know what it needs to do on Disney Plus to make numbers, but it could be the kind of thing that's like, it's just there. And people watch it and people find it. And if they like it, they like it. And if they don't, then they find something else to watch, but keep kind of building an audience with that, where maybe it's like, okay, 3 of these Columbo-style movies in, you're like, wow, this is really fun. I kind of am interested in what Kristen Ritter's doing. And then, maybe at that point, maybe you put her in one of the big screen ones, and everybody's like, hey, I've been seeing her in these Columbo-style movies on Disney Plus. I really dig this. I don't know. I don't know where Marvel goes from here, but I think, again, Phase 4 was sort of the watershed moment where Disney had Feige feed the monster. Feige figured, we got this, we can do this. It's one of the interesting differences between him and Theo Epstein was like, I'm doing this under protest. I don't want to go sign these players. I don't want to do all of this stuff. And when everything collapsed in 2011, he went and joined the Cubs, and he's now back with the Red Sox in an advisory role. So it's not like that relationship is sort of cool. It's not as bad as it might have been at the end of 2011. Whereas Kevin Feige, I think there was a part of Kevin Feige, there's a little hubris in there, was like, yeah, I think we can keep pumping stuff out and keep making money and printing cash. And now he's sort of had this reckoning where he's sort of trying to fix things. He did say he's been adamant that they're bringing back Robert Downey Jr. had nothing to do with the Jonathan Major stuff and had nothing to do with the movies not doing well, centered around Kang. That it was more like, once we found out we had a chance to get Robert Downey Jr., once we got Doctor Doom and the Fantastic Four characters back, and we had, we were going to do this anyway. This was coming no matter what. I don't know. I think, again, when you look at the Marvel movies that have done the best over the past, post-pandemic, they're all nostalgia fests, right? I mean, they're all either ones that are like, you look at the top 5 or so of their earners since the pandemic, and it's obviously, Spider-Man Far From Home, big time nostalgia fest. Let's bring in the old Spider-Man from the old movies. Yeah, this is going to be a ton of fun. Then you've got, Multiverse of Madness, where it's like, hey, check it out. Patrick Stewart's going to be in this, reprising his Professor X role. This is fantastic. And then Deadpool Wolverine, right, where it has like the greatest nostalgia scene ever, where you bring in Blade and Elektra, and then even like Channing Tatum's Gambit. Just a ton of fun. They're looking at these big hits that they've had that are all just nostalgia fest, and it's like, well, we're gonna keep that nostalgia train running to end out this MC, the multiverse saga here. But those are just band-aids on what I think is an interesting conundrum here, is that we've got this situation here with the comic book movies where they're not doing as well as they used to do, but the industry is saying, like, we need to just keep pumping out existing IP. And comic books are existing IP, just like Jurassic Park is an existing IP, and, whatever else, Fast and Furious. But yeah, most of these things, Mission Impossible. We just need to keep pumping these things out and seeing what they can do and see which ones catch and make a lot of money. I do wonder if maybe the real message that people are sending is, we would like to watch more stuff. But I by the same token, I mean, who goes out to the movies to watch more stuff nowadays? I think that's another piece of it, is that, if Hollywood gave us more variety, would we all go out and see it? Or would we wait for it all to be released on streamers? So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I guess we'll kind of see. But I mean, again, when you get into 2024, right, it's almost like a course correction. The whole Barbenheimer thing. I mean, every movie in the top 10 in 2024 is based on an existing IP. and in most cases they're also sequels. I guess Wicked's technically not a sequel. What is Wicked? A prequel? But it's definitely based off the Wizard of Oz IP. But everything else is some kind of sequel of some sort. And that's so this idea that Barbenheimer is some sort of like big change. I don't even like calling it Barbenheimer. It sounds obnoxious. I just hear that, and it seems to be the term that's used. But 2023, it felt like it was this watershed moment, and it really wasn't, because we're kind of right back where we were. And I think even 2025, we're kind of in a similar situation where everything is existing IP. The country that's making movies that aren't based off existing IP is China, and they're finding success that way. So maybe we need to look at what China's doing and see if we can sort of create stuff there. I don't know, but yeah, I do think that getting us to this moment now, we're here in the summer and everybody's rooting for Naked Gun to be this huge success, because we feel like it has to be a success so we can stop making comic book movies and we can stop making comedies again or whatever. It would be interesting to see if one of the studios goes out on a limb and says, you know what, we're just going to make them. And we'll see if any, we'll rebuild the market, because I think that's part of the thing, is that I think the market has to be rebuilt for these things. I don't think it's just a matter of if Naked Gun does well now we're just going to keep making them. No, I think you need to start building that market again to get more people out to want to watch comedies and maybe see less of the other things. And then, then maybe Disney says, okay, you know what, we're not going to make so many comic book movies. And for me, I like the comic book movies. I like seeing as many as possible. But I also think, 2024, there was more content, more MCU content in 2024, in Phase 4, in Marvel Phase 4, than there were in the previous 3 phases combined. And since, in the whatever it is, the 5 years, 6 years since the end of the Infinity Saga, they've done double the content that they did back then. So, yeah, Kevin Feige is talking about we're going to make less stuff, and I think Bob Iger had said, okay, we need to rethink our approach. But the thing is, when those dollar signs start rolling in, and if they get success with these Avengers movies, Disney is going to come, knocking again and saying, like, we need more content. We need to start pumping out, printing money again. And it'll be interesting to see what happens there if we get another Phase 4, whether they've learned their lessons from Phase 4, or if if these Avengers movies are successful as we think they might be, we end up with another Phase 4. Because I don't think Kevin Feige will be able to push back enough on that unless he does like Theo Epstein and quits and goes to the Cubs, And I don't see that happening because he's making too much money here, but I don't know. I guess we'll see. But yeah, here we are. We, again, I'm referring to the Marvels as MCU's chicken and beer moment. So, and I guess maybe I can kind of stop with this extended baseball metaphor. But yeah, maybe this is a good place for us to wrap things here. I hopefully enjoyed this conversation here, my rambling about MCU Phase 4, and we'll see, in next month if we come up with something for the DTVC Extra podcast again. But thank you for listening, and again, check out my novels, Nadia and Aiden. You can pick that up on Kindle Unlimited, and in paperback off of Amazon. The link is in the podcast description. Also have the link to my author page where you can pick up any of my novels. So if Nadia and Aiden doesn't sound like your speed, I've got other stuff. So go to my author page. See what you like and pick something up. I always appreciate if someone wants to buy my books. But again, thank you again for listening, and we'll be back soon. Bye, everyone.